Welcome to the Irish Revolution. Although compared to 1920, there wasn't all that much violence in 1919. In the public imagination, 1919 is the year that the Irish War of Independence broke out. In this month-by-month account of the war as it happened, please bear in mind that the events and groups for which the period is best known, the Flying Columns, the Black and Tans, the Reprisals, most of these came later, and it'll take a good year until I get that far. I'm hoping that with this series of videos that you'll get so immersed in the events, the characters and the politics that you'll be more than prepared for when the conflict escalates in 1920. Two things stand out in January 1919. The meeting of the first Dáil, as in the Irish Parliament, and the outbreak of hostilities by the shooting dead of some policemen by Dan Breen and the Tipperary IRA. Since both events took place on the same day, the 21st of January 1919, it is often seen as the opening salvo in the Irish War of Independence, a conflict that would end with the signing of the truce in July 1921, around 2.5 years long in total. I'll also talk briefly about efforts to secure international recognition of the Irish Republic at the end of the episode. So let's start with Soloheadbeg, County Tipperary. The Soloheadbeg ambush was not authorised by anyone in Dublin. It was a local act carried out by local actors, a phenomenon that will continue throughout the war. In fact, Richard Mulcahy, the IRA Chief of Staff, condemned it, as did Cal Brugha, who would be the Minister for Defence. Soloheadbeg, often seen as the beginning of the war, but it was a culmination of 2 years of steadily rising tensions and occasional violence. The shooting dead of 2 RIC men was a clear escalation of the brewing conflict. In fact, the operation had been bungled. They had taken the gelignite and explosive, but left the detonators behind. But however, to quote Michael Laffin, the historian, the shooting, quote, the shooting of the 2 RIC men marked a natural escalation of the violence and conflict which had long been a feature of Irish life. It was yet another provocation by the Irish volunteers, which in turn elicited a further drastic response on the part of the British authorities, and it locked the country even more firmly into its spiral towards war, unquote. The violence did not happen in a vacuum. There was an ongoing struggle between the political and military wing of the Republican movement and the IRA, as it would become known, were getting the upper hand. It was still unclear if the Dáil even had a notional control of the armed forces. In any case, it would be quite a while before the IRA swore an oath to the Dáil. By the way, I'm going to refer to them now as the Irish Republican Army, IRA, for simplicity's sake. They were still known as the Irish Volunteers by many, but gradually the name IRA was getting round. Many felt guilty for their inactivity in 1916, and in many ways felt that they had to compensate for that. Austin Stack, who felt miserable over his poor showing in Kerry in 1916, wrote that, quote, "I am ashamed of my abortive efforts to serve my country," unquote. The British seen Soloheadbeg not as the first shots fired in a war, but rather as a culmination of a campaign of low-level violence, reacted by banning fairs and markets for 3 months. This punished whole populations for the actions of a few men in Tipperary. It was a kind of disproportionate response that would gradually see the country slide into a war of independence against British rule. So, on the same day that the IRA, or a few men in Tipperary at least, started the conflict, the military conflict known as the War of Independence at Soloheadbeg in Tipperary, in Dublin, 28 men elected in the 1918 general election met at the Mansion House in Dublin to proclaim Dáil Éireann as the Legislative Assembly for Ireland. They spoke before a crowd of 100 journalists, most of whom were from abroad. Within a few hours they had approved a provisional constitution, appointed 3 delegates to the post-war peace conference in Paris, proclaimed the message to the free nations of the world, and declared a democratic programme, a declaration of core principles which would, in theory, inform future social policy. I'm going to cover the democratic programme and the social basis of the revolution in another episode, as I feel it would overly complicate today if I devoted a lot of time to it. The proceedings were carefully stage managed by Piers Beasley, the Republican propagandist. It had been described as dull yet electric. The session was opened with a prayer by Father Michael O'Flanagan, the Vice President of Sinn Fein, thus probably confirming in Unionist eyes that the Republic was a Catholic project. Many members of the new Parliament, they call themselves TDs, short for the Gaelic Teachta Dála, were in prison or on the run. Some of the more prominent absentees include Countess Markievicz, Eamon de Valera, who were in prison, and Michael Collins and Harry Boland, who were in England organising de Valera's jailbreak. All Irish MPs were invited, those who were elected in 1918, but in practice this was a convention of Sinn Féin TDs and they were the only ones who attended. The Labour Party, having decided not to challenge the 1918 election, had, in the words of Charles Townshend, quote, sacrificing itself, as had James Connolly, on the altar of national unity in the optimistic belief that Sinn Féin's sense of nationality could embrace social reform, unquote. This was to be more hope than reality, although the sentimental quasi-socialism of Padraig Pearse did have some adherents in the Republican movement, and a very few, not that many. The majority were essentially for the economic status quo. The formalities of the institution were closely and rather obviously modelled on the London Westminster Parliament, which these revolutionaries would have been very aware of. So much so that ministers used the British title secretary, as they did and do in Britain. They later began referring to themselves as minister, perhaps to differentiate from the British practice. The Declaration of Independence declared that the Irish people is by right a free people, and furthermore the Dáil demanded the evacuation of foreign troops. The message to the free nations was a call for international recognition of the Irish right to nationhood, which was informed greatly by US President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Even De Valera would soon go to America and attempt to garner recognition for the Irish Republic, raise money for the cause, and marshal the considerable forces of the Irish-American political movement over there. Now, a few words on the Democratic Programme. The Democratic Programme was a declaration of economic principles announced during the first Dáil. It outlined a socialistic policy of public ownership, state provision of healthcare, education, promotion of industrial development. The Labour Party even managed to get the Democratic Programme to declare that private property was subordinate to the general welfare. For all the excitement that left-wing people may have felt from this declaration, it was, according to Townshend again, quote, first watered down and then left to evaporate, unquote. Concerning the so-called government that Dáil Éireann proclaimed in January 1919, it's instructive to have a look at what Ernest Blythe, a prominent Sinn Féiner, said, quote, the work of the Department of Trade and Commerce was mostly pretense, having no value except as propagandist value, unquote. While the shadow state or counter-state may have been a propagandistic success, many of the departments in reality did very little. However, their mere existence was a challenge to British rule in Ireland, and as I have already said, they had major propaganda value. In some ways, which I'm now going to develop, the shadow state was a very real entity. Michael Collins would later become finance minister and raised a national loan which gave the Dáil enough money to cover running expenses, pay some salaries and afford some basic domestic spending. The Justice Ministry was obviously involved with the Dáil Courts, one of the more remarkable innovations of the revolutionary period, which we've covered in another episode. It was not a real shadow government in the sense that they didn't really have a government to run. Cala Brugha, for example, was a semi-absent Minister for Defence. Others were more energetic, of course. In any case, the war would not be centrally directed from Dublin. While Michael Collins was a shrewd intelligence gatherer and had a cunning mind, the war was won out in the countryside, in Cork, in Tipperary, in Longford and in other places. I hope that this narrative will be the focus of the channel and this series of videos, centering less on the undoubtedly significant efforts of Collins and the lads in Dublin, and more on the war in the country and the common people who made up the revolutionary generation. And finally, a few words on the Paris Peace Conference. The victorious Allied powers had gathered in Paris for the post-World War I Peace Conference. Many in Sinn Féin were optimistic that Ireland would get a hearing. In hindsight, if anyone truly believed this, then they were quite naive. According to Dáil Figgis, declaring a republic as they had done with the first Dáil had been a mistake. As, to quote Charles Townshend once again, quote, the peace conference would now be asked not to investigate and adjudicate a national claim, but to recognise an already existing republic, approving an act hostile to a great power, unquote. The chances of international recognition of the republic by the peace conference were slim to none. The Dáil's three appointed delegates to the conference, Count Plunkett, Arthur Griffith and Éireann de Valera, were unable to get visas to travel to France in any case. The most optimistic among the optimists may well have believed in the power of the Irish-American lobby, but it was unable to truly shift core foreign policy interests in Washington. Sean T. O'Kelly went to Paris and appointed himself representative of the provisional government. I stress he appointed himself. He went on to write a fairly cringy letter to the American president and accomplished nothing. Finally, I'd like to finish on an ominous note. On the 31st of January on Tuglock, The IRA Volunteer Journal announced that England and Ireland were now at war and that volunteers were to treat the British Army exactly the same way as they would an invading army. Although it would take a little bit more time for many to get the message, the Irish War of Independence had broken out. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much, guys.